Hello, I'm Natasha from Winter's Bloom, and Sophia and I have been compiling a list of books for our anti-racist book list. So Sophia has 6 books that she's recommending, and I have 6 books as well. Just before we jump in, a little bit of context about myself. I'm a Filipina-American woman, born and raised in the US and currently living in the US, so a lot of my understanding about racism is based in the United States context. So with that, I guess I'll just jump into my book recommendations. So the first one is White Fragility by Diangelo, and I know this is a very popular one at the moment, as it should be. I really respect Diangelo. She has a lot of experience in the realm, in the field of talking to white people about race, and I really value this book because as I was reading it, it just gave me so much insight into why I've personally had problems talking to white people about race, and so I think it's a good book for everyone to read.
So the first book that I would like to recommend is written by Reni Eddo-Lodge, and it's entitled Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. This book traces British history, surveying the links between gender, class and race. It does go beyond British history, but the focus is always on Britain, which I think is a very important contribution to the literature about race and about racial injustice. As growing up in the UK, I've often felt that the discussion has quite often been outsourced to the US, to US examples of like the civil rights movement, of stock names like Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Black History Month growing up here has always been, for me, characterized by African Americans or Black issues and racial issues in the US. So this book really draws it home to the UK, and it looks at key historical moments such as slavery and police brutality, and how the origins of those systems have continued to have enduring effect upon Black and ethnic minorities' experiences.
The next book I wanted to recommend is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I read this book a while ago when I was in college. One of my good friends recommended this book to me, and I think that this is an important, not a counterpart, because I don't necessarily believe in binaries, but part of the bigger picture that Diangelo is trying to look at. This one the subtitle is Mass Incarceration During a Time of Colorblindness, and so it looks at some of the more institutional reasons and factors behind mass incarceration of people of color. So that's a look at more of the policies and the practices as a society and as a nation that the US holds against people of color.
Don't Touch My Hair is a book written by Emma Dabiri, and it explores Western constructs on the themes of beauty, gender and time in particular, but there are many other themes as well, all through the prism of black hair. And so this book departs from a more personal note. It departs from Dabiri's own experiences growing up as a visibly mixed woman in Dublin, Ireland. And it kind of gets interwoven with the wider scope of what was happening in society at the time, and kind of looking back to her ancestry and also looking forward in a way to present time and also what the future holds. The scope of her book is very wide. She talks about everything from African slavery to pre-colonial Africa, and really goes into depth in a way that is very educational. This book was actually our book pick of the month for the month of June, on the themes of healing and sharing gifts. So if you are interested, there will be a full book review linked below in the description bar. But the reason why I've picked this book is because I think it offers a really important occasion to challenge Eurocentric engagement with Afro-textured hair and Black culture. But beyond that as well, it goes to show how hair has over the years been used as a tool to police Black women and as a form of political oppression. And it's something which I feel is not acknowledged, and even if it is, it's kind of acknowledged within the the Black community. So I think this is a really eye-opening book to show the importance of hair and how it goes beyond just, you know, expression of self, but how it can be used as a tool of oppression.
The next one is called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. And I've actually just started reading this book, so I'm not super far in yet, but I really like this book because I think it's another piece of the puzzle. Basically, he is talking about before we can really make any policy change or any law changes, what needs to happen is that we need to deal with the trauma in our bodies. So he approaches it from 3 different angles, from the Black body, the white body, and the police or enforcer body. And he's very clear about how he doesn't want to pigeonhole anyone into these identities. What he wants as you're reading this book is to listen to your body and be aware of the reactions of your body and the traumas that might mean that you're holding. And so I think that where Robin DiAngelo was more about the cognitive processes of racism, and Michelle Alexander is more about the societal problems. Resmaa Menakem is about the body and the intuitive. So I really value his perspective.
The next book I would like to recommend is called The Good Immigrant, and it was edited by Nikesh Shukla, and it's a collection of 21 essays written by BAME authors. And this again was a book that I think I reviewed last month, but again the full book review will be in the description bar in case you are interested in reading more about it. But this essentially is a collection of essays written from different perspectives and different voices of different ethnic minorities living in the UK, and confronting the issues of race and immigration in particular in 21st century Britain. Many of the essays housed within this collection have overlapping themes of cultural appropriation, of identity, of race, discrimination, migration, and they all come at these topics with the nuance of their own experiences, their own lived experiences, of their own kind of cultural heritage as well, and their own perspective on life. Yeah, at the same time, there's almost a unity in sharing those experiences of the so-called other in society, and I found it in a way to be empowering as a second-generation immigrant. It just kind of puts into perspective that you are seen, that the experiences that you have are not, you're not going through them alone, and that you're not paranoid, which is something which I have felt at certain moments in my life, particularly when I've talked to certain groups of people, particularly white people, about race, that it can feel that it's just kind of all in your head, especially if that experience isn't shared and acknowledged as a valuable and legit experience. So I think this book is essential for anyone to read, but particularly for second, third generation immigrants who have lived in the UK and are struggling between the different cultures and the different heritages and different aspects of their identity that manifest and have to coexist in the UK and in the space that we are living in. It touches upon everything from the seemingly small things, again, seemingly small, like hair, to accents, to knowing how to use different languages to talk to different groups of people. And I feel like touching on those seemingly small things kind of gives an acknowledgement of how real those experiences are and how those small things contribute to migrants' experiences growing up and living in the UK.
The fourth one is If They Come For Us by Fatimah Asghar, and this is a book of poems. She is a Pakistani Kashmiri American woman, and her poetry is hauntingly beautiful, extremely honest, and it talks, what I found so compelling about the way that she deals with race is how prejudice and discrimination and racism can really kind of like pivot on a dime based off of wider societal or political regime changes, and the ways that those show up, particularly in terms of intergenerational trauma. So I highly recommend her poetry. It's very beautiful.
The next book which I'd like to recommend is called Woman, Race and Class by Angela Davis, and this book essentially surveys the history of the feminist movement from the abolitionist days to present day US, and it particularly looks at the ways in which the movement has failed to help those women who also have marginalized identities, so namely women of a lower social class and black women, and of course the intersection of the two. The reason why I've chosen this book is because I think it's a very important and accessible read into understanding how black women have both historically and continue to be oppressed due to the intersection of their race, their class, and their gender. And so it makes a very important contribution, I think, to intersectionality theory, which, in case you guys are unfamiliar with, is a theoretical framework which examines how our social and political identities, so as I mentioned, gender, race, class, it could even be sexual orientation, your ability, your height, the list goes on, combined to create unique forms of discrimination based on possessing more than one of those identities. If you're interested in knowing a bit more about intersectionality theory, me and Natasha have recorded a podcast which will be linked below as well. But I do think this book makes a very important contribution to that, and again, it's one of those books that I think is for everyone, but particularly for those who are in a privileged position and do not understand how, or maybe have not even had the opportunity to consider how multiple identities coming together creates for a unique and very specific form of discrimination.
The next one is called Home Fire by Kamila, Shamsie, and this one is actually written in a UK context, and I came across this in a Books and Boba book pick of the month a few months ago. It is based off of the Greek tragedy Antigone, so it deals with two Pakistani British families, and it calls into question loyalty to home, loyalty to family, loyalty to country, and it really deals very well with showing how the process of othering takes place, and like how and why that happens, and what happens when something becomes extremely politicized. And as a US citizen, someone growing up in this context, this book shed a lot of light into what's going on in the UK and how racism shows up in the UK.
The Other Side of Truth, written by Beverley Naidoo, I'm really sorry if I'm butchering anyone's name as well, is probably the very first book that I have ever read that really confronted race in a very subtle way as well, which I'll get on to talk about in a bit. I studied this book at school when I was about 13 years old, and I definitely feel that it's a book that works on multiple levels, so for different age groups. I actually gave it to my younger sister, when she was probably 10 years old to read, and she was able to grasp some elements and some themes that emerged from that book. But definitely as an adult as well, it's an accessible read, and I think you would probably have a different perspective reading it on later on in life compared to reading it earlier. Before I get into the plot, I just want to warn any of you guys who do not like spoilers that there are quite a few spoilers, so if you want to read this book and you don't want any spoilers, then I would recommend skipping to the next book recommendation. But this book follows the story of 12-year-old Sadie and her brother Femi, who flee to the UK because their father is a political journalist who refuses to stop openly criticising the Nigerian military rule. As a result, their mum is murdered, and their father pays for someone to smuggle them into the UK, promising to join them later on. But it happens that when they arrive, the woman who's paid to smuggle them abandons them in Victoria Station, and it kind of unfolds from there, their journey of living in the UK and basically being abandoned in the UK. So the story is told through the perspective of Sadie, and it explores what it is to be illegal and the experiences and difficulties that come with being a refugee. And I think that is probably the most like basic level that it can be read on, and one which I understood or interpreted the book when I was reading it and studying it at the age of 13. Reading it again now that I'm slightly older, quite a bit older, I think what the underlying themes are to that book are definitely a very covert discussion about race, and also about British imperialism and of course British colonisation of Nigeria, and the effects that has left, the long enduring effects that it has left on Nigeria, and the role that it has played in creating a space where, for example, freedom of speech has been curtailed and is still, in some respects, a dangerous thing to fight for. That book really kind of highlights the colonial heritage that Nigeria has adopted, and the way that has shaped modern day Nigeria as well.
The final book that I wanted to recommend is called Steel Crow Saga by Paul Kruger, and this was another Books and Boba pick, and it's a more fantastical book. Might be good for middle grade or young adult readers, but honestly I enjoyed it, and I'm 25 years old. But basically it's in this fantastical world, loosely based off of Asia, though you can kind of relate the different characters or different cultures to actual Asian cultures. But the reason why I'm recommending it here is because they deal with racism a lot. There's a lot of prejudice and discrimination amongst the different cultures in this book. And it also follows the internal processes of the different characters, both the characters who are exhibiting racism and who are receiving racism. And it goes through their internal processes in a very approachable way. So I think that this is a really valuable addition to this book list.
So the last book which I'm going to recommend is one of my all-time favourites, and it is Americanah by Chimmanda Ngozi Adichie. And this book is probably the only other book that I read during my secondary school years to do with race and with identity, and it's one that I actually read at the recommendation of a friend, which I'm so grateful for, and we actually filmed a book review many years ago now, but again, if you're interested, I will link it down below, because I think quite a lot of my thoughts about that book still remain unchanged. But this book is framed as a love story between Ifemelu and Obinze, I think is his name. And it's like a love story about two childhood sweethearts who grew up in Nigeria and then migrate to the UK and to the US on their respective path to find their fortune and to build their future. And so whilst it is framed as a love story, which I'm a sucker for love stories, so this is why it probably is one of my favourite books, it also it spans that, and it goes beyond that, and it allows for an exploration of race, of identity, of loss, loneliness, just to name a few elements, across the span of 3 different continents. So we hear about, or we read about, Efemelu's experience of race in the US and Obinze's experience of race in the UK, and how all of those 3 things intersect and interact with their Nigerian heritage. When I read this at 16, it was really an eye-opener for me, because it was the first time I had really explicitly dealt with the concepts of race, and also given much thought to my identity as a mixed black woman. So I would definitely recommend this, of course, to anyone, but I think it is a really good entry point if you are perhaps not, you find it hard to have these conversations in a more academic and formal setting or formal language. This, the element of fiction and the love story kind of provides a good balance between, a good relief between just good literature and also having really important and heavy conversations. So those are just a few of our own book recommendations which we think are important books that make a really important contribution to expanding the conversation about race, race relations, and everything that is currently being brought up again to the forefront of UK media, US media, and hopefully beyond that as well. Natasha and I are always looking to read more around the topic. This of course is not a limited list. There are so many other books out there, so if you guys do have any book recommendations that you could give us, we'd really appreciate that. If you could leave it in the comments below, and we'll definitely be sure to check those out. We hope that this book list has encouraged you to get more involved in the narrative. I know it can be a scary one to get involved in, especially if you feel like you don't have the knowledge with which to approach certain topics, and that's something that I think that both Natasha and I are working on, to be more informed about what is happening and to have the knowledge to make important contributions to that discussion. Thank you for watching this video, and we will see you in the next one. Bye!